The night the blizzard reached its peak, Wren Calloway stood between her three cabins with a lantern that barely pushed back the dark. Snow came sideways, sharp as ground glass, and the wind off the Bighorn Mountains carried the kind of cold that didn't just chill it, pressed like something ancient and indifferent that had been doing this long before there were people to suffer it and would continue long after. From somewhere across the settlement came the sound of a man shouting into wind that swallowed the words before they reached anyone. From somewhere else, a child was crying in the way children cry when the cold has already reached them, and the crying is involuntary, the body's last signal before it stops spending energy on signals. Wren did not move toward those sounds. She turned in a slow circle, checking each roof line, each chimney, each sealed door in the flicker of her lantern. 3 columns of smoke rose into the black sky above her, steady as breath from something that knew how to stay alive. Then she went inside. 4 months before that night, she was the woman no one in Harlan's Crossing had troubled themselves to learn the name of. The wagon came into the settlement on a Tuesday in the first week of September, 1883. Though Wren had stopped measuring time in days somewhere back in the Nebraska Territory, the left rear wheel was missing its outer iron rim. She'd replaced it with a length of rope wound tight enough to last another 40 miles no more, and she had 40 miles to spare. The horse, a gray gelding she'd named Burr for the way he'd pressed his nose into her palm the first morning she owned him, moved with the careful economy of an animal that had learned not to waste anything on hope, including momentum. Behind her on the wagon bed, her 3 children sat quiet among the bundles. Eli, 14, had positioned himself nearest the tailgate arms, resting on his knees, eyes moving across the incoming terrain with the slow deliberateness of someone who had been arriving in new places long enough to know they were only safe after they were understood. Cora, 11, sat with her back against a rolled canvas, turning a small folded paper in her hands. She'd read it so many times the creases had gone soft as cloth, but she kept it anyway. Amos, 9, had his chin propped on a bundle of rags watching the town come into view with the particular expression of a child who has been taught by experience rather than instruction that arriving somewhere means nothing yet. Harlan's Crossing was 14 structures scattered across a high-grass basin at the foot of the Bighorn Range, the mountains themselves visible to the northwest as a dark wall that seemed to consume the upper sky. A creek ran along the eastern edge low in September, its banks showing the bleached limestone that meant it would be a threat of itself by November. The cabins were spread wide across the basin in the manner of men who want to claim as much ground as their eyeline covers. Most were single-room structures, tall and broad-shouldered, with high-pitched roofs and plank doors wide enough to suggest their owners expected company of importance. One had a porch not yet settled into the soft ground, already listing toward the south. Glass windows on 3 of them caught the afternoon light and returned it in small flashes that were almost cheerful. Silas Pruitt was on his store porch when the wagon rolled past a 2-room building with a hand-lettered sign and a covered porch from which he conducted the business of knowing everything that moved through Harlan's Crossing. He was 55 wide through the chest, with a gray beard kept at a length that split the difference between groomed and formidable. He watched Wren set the brake with the movement of someone who had done it 10,000 times, step down without reaching for anything to hold, and land squarely on the packed dirt road. He watched her turn toward the settlement with her gray-blue eyes doing the kind of assessing that never quite finished. Her hair was dark brown with silver threading through at both temples, not a single strand of it, but a streak that had arrived early and stayed the way hard experience tends to do. Her shoulders were wider than most men expected of women, not from any physical gift, but from years of lifting what needed lifting without asking for help. Her wool skirt was dark and practical. Her canvas apron had been worn to a softer color at the thighs from years of hands dried on it. The shawl she wore over her coat had been mended in 3 places. Each mend was straight, the stitches running true as a plumb line. Silas noticed this and held on to it the way the mind holds incongruent details when it can't yet locate their significance. He said to no one in particular, "Well?" She didn't acknowledge him. She spoke quietly to Eli, who climbed down and moved to the horse's head. Then she stood looking at the settlement with the stillness of someone taking inventory. Del Tanner appeared in the smithy doorway. May Griggs materialized in a window. Pastor Dunmore stopped walking somewhere between the church and his rectory and stood with his hands clasped at his back in the habitual posture of a man who was perpetually anticipating either news or trouble. The settlement noticed her the way small places notice anything new quietly from fixed positions without committing to an expression until they decided what they thought. She didn't linger in the road. She approached the store porch and asked Silas whether the ground north of the basin near the bluffs was available for claim. He told her it was in the tone of someone correcting a misunderstanding before it became a commitment. "Nobody builds near the bluffs," he said. "Wind off the mountains hits that north patch from November to March like a fist through a paper wall. The east acreage near the creek is your sensible option." She was looking at the northern skyline when he said this at the pale limestone ridge of the bluffs, catching the low afternoon light. "How deep does the frost line run up there in January?" she asked. He didn't know exactly. He said so with the addition that it barely mattered for the reasons already stated. She thanked him one syllable flat like a door closing, then walked back to her wagon, released the brake, and drove north. He watched the wagon diminish toward the bluffs. Del Tanner came to stand beside him. "What does she want up there?" Silas had no satisfactory answer. He offered one anyway, which was his habit. She stood in the middle of the north patch for nearly half an hour before she did anything else. The children waited in the wagon. This was not new. She had stopped like this in other places in other states, and the children had learned that when she went still in a new place, she was doing something that looked like nothing, but was in fact the most important work she did. She was reading it. The patch sat in the concavity form where the bluffs curved slightly west, creating a natural windbreak on two sides. The gap in the ridge that Silas had cited, she clocked it from the road, measured its angle against the direction of the prevailing northwest wind, would deflect the worst of the sustained blizzard cold north before it reached this hollow fully. Not completely. But the difference between a direct hit and a deflected one over the course of a Wyoming winter was the difference between manageable and not. The soil under her boots was firm. She crouched, pressed 3 fingers into it, felt the give stop quickly at a layer that didn't move. Limestone shelf close to the surface. Foundation ground. She stood. "This'll do," she said, not to anyone in particular. But Eli nodded and jumped down from the wagon. Camp was established in the failing light tent fire bedrolls with the practiced speed of a family that had done it in conditions worse than clear-skied September. When the children slept, Wren sat by the fire with the notebook open across her knees. It was oilskin bound, cracked at the spine, the pages dense with her small, careful handwriting. There were diagrams, floor plans, elevation drawings, material lists, with quantities and substitution notes. There were calculations on heat retention in confined spaces, on the thermal behavior of clay-based mortars at different temperatures, on roof pitch angles, and their relationship to snow accumulation load. One page was a comparison of wood consumption rates for stoves of different capacities in rooms of different volumes. She had done these calculations over 3 years in laundry rooms and railroad camp cookhouses and boarding house back rooms during the hours when the work was done and the children were asleep and the thinking could begin. Near the back of the notebook, a simple diagram, 3 small squares in a row, each labeled sleeping, cooking, storage. She looked at the diagram for a long time. Then she looked at the dark ground where the morning would show her exactly what she'd chosen. In December of 1879, she'd had 1 room, 1 stove, 5 children. Her husband had been dead 8 months, a shaft collapse at a mine she had never entirely believed was safely operated. Not that her believing had mattered. The winter that year came mild and then turned without warning, the temperature falling 40 degrees across one night, the way a ledge gives out no gradual warning, just the sudden absence of what had been holding. She had wood, she'd been careful, she thought she'd been careful, but she had calculated against an average winter, and this one was not average. 1 cord short, maybe less. She'd rationed through the first cold snap, fed the stove and measured amounts, told herself she was managing. On the night of the 14th, she felt the temperature drop again through the wall, and she burned more than she should have, trying to build the heat before the room lost it entirely. She told the older children to draw their blankets up. She lay down intending to wake in 2 hours. She woke to gray morning light, to silence, to a cold so complete it seemed to have substance to press back when she moved through it. The 2 youngest had gone in the night, in the hours after the fire burned to ash, and the room's stored warmth followed it out through every gap. She hadn't thought to seal every imperfection she hadn't thought to find. Not sickness, not accident, Cold. One room with one fire that had failed and nothing else to go to. She had dug their graves in ground that resisted the shovel for 4 hours. Then she had packed her 3 surviving children and everything that remained of her life into a wagon and gone west because staying meant being present at the site of that failure every day, and she was not finished. She had not yet done what she needed to do. She had not yet built the thing she should have built before that night, the thing that would have meant that when one fire failed, there was somewhere else to go, something else still warm, some other room still holding. She had spent 3 years figuring out exactly what that thing looked like. Now she was going to build it. The first week was stone. The creek bed to the east, running low enough to expose its banks, held flat limestone pieces in the sizes she needed. She and Eli waded in water cold enough to ache after 3 minutes and loaded stones into canvas sacks that they dragged back on a low sled she'd built from scrap lumber in Kansas. Cora organized the stones by size and flatness on the ground. Amos mixed clay batches, learning by failure the texture that held correctly too wet, and it ran too dry and it wouldn't bond, and the right consistency was something the hands had to find before the mind could name it. She showed him once, then watched him until he found it himself. People observed. They observed from horseback, from doorways from the road. They did not offer to help. No one brought a tool or a nail or an afternoon of labor. What they brought was commentary conducted at a range that suggested they believed she couldn't hear them, which was wrong. 3 cabins, Del Tanner said to his wife. 3. Who does she think she is? She'll be burning furniture by February. Silas told anyone who asked, and several who hadn't. One woman Wren would learn, her name was Harriet Coombs, stood at a distance of perhaps 60 yards one Thursday morning for nearly an hour watching. She never approached. She left without speaking. Wren did not know what the watching meant, but she felt it the way she felt all observation, as something to be aware of and not distracted by. On a Friday in the second week, Silas Pruitt made the walk north. He came with his thumbs in his suspenders and his opinions already formed. He observed that she was pulling a great deal of stone from the creek for what he understood to be one cabin. She told him it was 3. The silence that followed had weight and geometry. He looked at the staked foundations, 3 rectangles clearly defined, clearly intentional, and he delivered his assessment. 1 room, good stove, properly managed, was sufficient for a family of 4. 3 fires were more than one woman could maintain without a man chopping full days. The ceilings looked too low already. He was doing her a favor, he implied by his tone, by telling her these things now, before she committed further. She was carrying 2 flat stones when he said most of this, walking toward the first foundation. She set them down, straightened, and looked at him. 1 fire goes out, she said. 1 room goes cold. 3 fires, 3 rooms. 1 goes out, 2 don't. She picked up her trowel. I'm not building for comfort, Mr. Pruitt. I'm building for January. He said something further about it being an awful lot of building for a woman. She looked at him with the gray-blue eyes that assessed without performing, and she said it in a voice that carried no heat but landed with the weight of something that had been settled long before this conversation. Then it's a good thing I'm not building it for a man. He left. The opinion of the settlement hardened in the days that followed, not into cruelty exactly, but into the particular confidence of people who believed their experience constituted authority. They'd built 1 cabin each. They'd survived in them. The widow's 3-cabin plan was the kind of mistake only an outsider would make, and they'd be proven right by December. Not a nail was offered. Not a morning of help. On the 3rd morning of the second week, Agnes Holt walked north. She was 72, moved without hurrying, but also without pausing, and carried a canvas sack over one shoulder and a small piece of folded paper. She arrived at the work site, examined the foundations, and the first course of logs on 2 of the cabins, set the sack on the ground near Wren without speaking, and held out the paper. Wren unfolded it. Pack it wet. Seal it dry. Don't let it crack before first frost. The sack held a finer clay than anything from the creek, pale gray-white with a mineral density that Wren could feel in the way it pressed back against her fingers. She understood immediately what it was. For chimney joints, the most failure-prone point in any cold-climate construction, the place where freeze-thaw cycles crack standard clay mortars and let cold air find its way into flues and smoke find its way into rooms. This clay, properly applied, would not crack. Agnes had already turned and was making her way back south. She did not wait for acknowledgement because she had not come for it. Two women who understood that the material was the message and that anything added to it was noise. May Griggs arrived the following Wednesday. She came with a bucket of nails and a claw hammer and the manner of someone who had assessed a situation privately and reached a decision that she was not interested in debating. She went directly to the sleeping cabin, ran her hand along a floor joist, found a gap, picked up a nail, and drove it. Wren watched from the cooking cabin wall where she was pressing clay into a joint. She watched May assess and drive and move on to the next joist. Then she picked up her trowel and went back to her own work. Silas arrived within the hour. He had seen May leave the house. His expression when he found her on her knees in the widow's sleeping cabin floor was the expression of a man whose order has been disrupted without his permission. He said her name in the warning register. May drove another nail. She did not look up. He stepped to the edge of the open cabin wall. "You've got no business here." Wren heard this from the cooking cabin. She set down her trowel and looked across at Silas. She did not speak. She waited. He turned to her. "My wife isn't going to be part of this." Her voice when it came was even and neither unkind nor accommodating. "Then go tell her that." He turned back to May. May had moved on to the next gap. She was working with the focus of someone who has decided what she's doing and finds interruption genuinely puzzling. Silas stood in the open doorway for a time that was long enough to be uncomfortable, long enough for everyone present to understand that he was not going to win this by standing there and that he was arriving at this understanding in real time. He turned and walked south. Eli watched him go and then looked at his mother, who had already picked up her trowel. Cora, from her stone sorting area, observed the entire sequence and then returned to her work. Later, when Amos asked why Mr. Pruitt had left looking like that, Cora considered it with the gravity of an 11-year-old who has been watching adults fail long enough to develop working theories. He thought Mama would back down. She didn't. He thought Mrs. Griggs would stop when he told her to. She didn't either. That made him feel like something was wrong with the world. She set a stone in its place. The world was fine. May came back 3 more times that week and twice the week after. She and Wren never discussed what May was building toward, or why she'd decided to come, or what she made of the whole undertaking. They worked in proximity with the efficiency of people whose understanding of each other ran below the level of conversation. The walls rose through the 4th week. Cottonwood logs, lighter than pine but available and sufficient, notched at the corners, with a technique Wren had read about, and then practiced on scrapwood until her hands knew it without her eyes. The notches were tighter than anything else in the settlement, requiring almost no chinking. Where the logs weren't perfectly uniform and chinking was needed, she used a mixture she'd tested twice before settling on the proportions. Creek clay, dried grass, wood ash combined in a ratio that expanded slightly on wetting and contracted minimally on drying, which meant it sealed better after the first winter's freeze-thaw cycle than it had to begin with. The chimneys went up low, lower than anyone in Harlan's Crossing would have built them. Silas, passing on horseback in the last week of October, saw the chimney height and called across without stopping. "Chimney that short won't pull right. Smoke'll come inside before Christmas." Wren was on the exterior wall of the storage cabin. She did not answer. The calculation was not complicated. A low chimney with correct interior dimensions drew adequately in still conditions, and in high wind, the shorter the chimney, the less leverage the wind had against the base. The tall chimneys in the settlement were proud. They were also levers. She had read about this. She had thought about it. She had built accordingly. By the last days of October, all 3 cabins were sealed. She plastered the exterior with her mud and straw mixture section by section, bottom to top, then washed the entire exterior of each cabin with lye made from burned bone ash. The lye hardened the clay, created water resistance, gave the walls a pale color that Amos said looked like chalk, and Cora said looked like old bone. They were both right. The cabins were not pretty. They were low and plain and close together against the bluff, 3 compact shapes that looked less like they'd been built and more like they'd been found there. Each had its purpose, and the purpose was not decorative. The sleeping cabin was the smallest and the tightest, a single small stove against the north wall shelves, along the south wall packed with bundled quilts and canvas-covered hay mattresses, a ceiling barely above Eli's head. Fed twice in the evening and once before first light, it held its warmth through any night the stove survived. The cooking cabin was the working heart of the 3, with the cast iron stove, The heavy table, the dried herbs above the beams, the sealed bins of flour and lard and salt. The storage cabin's door stayed always closed, its interior a discipline. Wood stacked on runners above the floor to keep the bottom logs clear of ground moisture. A dugout depression in the back, stone-lined and sealed, holding what she didn't discuss. Medical supplies, preserved food wax, seed packets, the notebook. On a shelf above the seed tin in that storage cabin, two drawings on canvas scraps made in charcoal. One evening in Indiana, when the room was quiet enough for the kind of grief that doesn't announce itself, but simply arrives and requires acknowledgement. Two faces, small, exact enough. She had put them there because she could not carry them in her hands each day and could not leave them without a location. They needed to be somewhere. This was where she kept them. The doorbar lived in her apron pocket always. On the last evening of October, she sat in the passage between the sleeping cabin and the cooking cabin after the children were inside. The sky was clear and enormously cold, the kind of cold that was a rehearsal for the cold coming. Stars were out in quantities that only made sense at elevation in darkness, away from other light. She took out the notebook, opened to the back page, looked at the diagram of 3 squares in a row. She looked at the 3 cabins around her, at the pale walls in the starlight, at the low roof lines she'd angled to 6 degrees past what felt natural, because the physics said 6 degrees was the margin between snow sliding clear and snow accumulating to structural weight. She looked at the chimney caps, barely visible above the roof lines. She thought about the narrow passages between the cabins that would become covered walkways, come winter canvas stretched on wooden frames to keep the paths clear between doors prepared and stacked in the storage cabin already. She allowed herself for one moment to feel the distance between the diagram and the thing she was sitting inside. All the stone and clay and cut timber and exhausted evenings and bruised hands, and the 1,000 small decisions that had accumulated into this 3 small sealed cabins on a patch of ground no one else had wanted. She looked at all of it, and she let herself believe for that one moment that it might be enough. Then she put the notebook away and went inside. Eli was lying awake looking at the ceiling close above him. He turned his head when she came in the quiet low enough not to wake the others. "You think it'll hold?" She hung her coat, sat on the edge of the platform, began working the laces of her boots with fingers stiff from the cold. She looked at the coals in the small stove, at the way their light moved across the low ceiling in slow pulses. She did not answer him. He understood the way he'd learned to understand the things she communicated by not speaking, that she had done what could be done, and now winter would give its verdict because winter was the only judge left in Wyoming territory that told the truth. Outside, the first real breath of November moved through the gap in the Bighorn Ridge and crossed the basin of Harlan's Crossing. It found the 14 cabins of the settlement and tested each one in sequence, pressing its seams, reaching into the spaces between logs, searching for the places where warmth could be pulled out and cold pushed in. When it reached the 3 low shapes at the north edge of the basin, it moved along their clay-washed walls, found no purchase, continued south. The stove in the sleeping cabin burned low and even through the night, and the 3 children of Wren Calloway slept warm, and outside the temperature dropped 11 degrees before morning, and not one of them felt it. November arrived in Harlan's Crossing, the way bad news arrives quietly at first, almost politely, and then all at once. The 3rd day of the month brought a frost that settled overnight and did not lift by mid-morning the way the men of the settlement had been expecting it to. Horses stood in their paddocks with their breath coming in short bursts, ice crystallized in the corners of their eyes. The creek, already low, developed a thin skin of ice along its quieter edges that cracked when Del Tanner's boy stepped on it, and then reformed by the following morning. The sky had the particular colorless quality of high elevation, cold, not gray, exactly, more like all the color had been removed from it, leaving something that functioned as sky without committing to being one. The men of Harlan's Crossing had known this was coming. They'd known it the way everyone in Wyoming territory knew winter was coming, in the abstract, in the general, in the way that knowing a thing is true does not always translate into behaving as if it is. Del Tanner had meant to split more wood in October. Silas Pruitt had meant to have his chimney repointed before the freeze set in. The mortar had shown hairline cracks in September, the kind you could ignore through summer without consequence. Pastor Dunmore had meant to seal the north-facing window of his rectory, where the fit between frame and wall had been loose in spring. Most of them had meant to do things they had not done because summer and fall had offered other demands, other justifications, and the cold had always come and always passed before, which is the particular logic that makes catastrophe possible. Wren's wood had been curing in the storage cabin since mid-October. 4 weeks of covered elevated drying in Wyoming's low humidity air produced fuel that caught fast, burned hot, left minimal ash, released its heat efficiently, rather than spending most of it on its own moisture. When Eli carried the first armload into the cooking cabin on the morning of November 3rd, the wood was the color of pale sand dry through the core. He did not need to coax it. He did not need to use more than the kindling Cora had bundled and stacked in clay pots, sealed with wax-thin split pine, wrapped with dried pine needle clusters, 24 of them prepared in October and waiting precisely for this morning. From the cooking cabin stove, smoke rose within minutes of the first light. Across the settlement, it was an hour before any other chimney showed the same. People noticed. They noticed in the way that people notice things. They have decided not to be instructed by registering the fact, filing it into a category labeled coincidence or luck, or the particular advantages of arriving without furniture to arrange and children without a school to attend, and then continuing with the logic they had already committed to. Silas walked past the northern end of the settlement that morning, saw the smoke from Wren's 3 chimneys against the pale sky, saw the absence of smoke from most of the cabins he passed, and chose not to draw the comparison that offered itself. By the second week of November, the temperature had settled into something sustained. Not the worst was coming, but sustained cold that exposed every weakness in construction that a milder season had been willing to overlook. The gap in the Pruitt cabin's north wall where 2 logs met imperfectly and the chinking had dried and contracted over the summer, now let in a thread of air that moved across the floor at ankle height for 20 feet. Silas's daughter had taken to wearing her boots inside, which he told himself was a habit children picked up. The Tanner cabin's roof, which had a slight sag in the center that Dell had planned to address in spring, now collected pooling meltwater during the brief mid-afternoon thaw and then refroze each evening, adding small incremental weight to the structure night by night. On the 14th of November, a storm came. Not the storm that was still weeks away, but a substantial precursor. 2 days of wind-driven snow that dropped 8 inches across the basin, blocked the road south for 36 hours, drove 3 of the settlement's chickens into corners of their coops, where they froze and opened a seam in Del Tanner's roof wide enough that the meltwater on the following clear day dripped steadily onto the center of his table. He spent the afternoon in his attic in the cold, packing the seam with rags and pine tar, doing it properly now, which was the particular experience of doing correctly what should have been done earlier under conditions considerably less forgiving. The widow's 3 cabins took no visible damage. This was the fact that people tried not to discuss directly, which meant they discussed it constantly in the adjacent language of speculation and qualification. The wind hadn't hit that north patch as hard, the bluffs deflected some of it. She had nobody dropping in, no door open for visitors, so naturally the heat held. Small rooms were easier to manage when you had no reason to move between them. All of these were true enough as isolated statements. None of them quite covered the fact that on the morning after the storm, Eli walked between the 3 cabins in the recovered stillness, carrying wood under a canvas tarp, his footprints going out from the sleeping cabin and returning to it with the even spacing of someone who was not hurrying, because hurrying was not necessary. The rotation system that Cora had charted on a piece of paper and pinned to the cooking cabin's center post ran without variance through November. Morning fire in the cooking cabin started before full light maintained through the working hours. The sleeping cabin stove was fed twice in the evening, once at the start of the supper hour, to begin building heat once just before the family settled for the night, with the damper adjusted to slow burn. The door between the cooking cabin's narrow entry hall and its main room, a double door Wren had built with an air gap between the 2 panels, was kept closed except when someone was actively passing through it. Every time a door opened, heat escaped. Every time a door stayed closed, it didn't. The arithmetic of this was not complicated, but it required the kind of continuous attention that most people applied to other things. Amos, who had been assigned the task of monitoring the sleeping cabin stove through the night when Wren needed to work late, had developed a sensitivity to its sound that woke him more reliably than any alarm. A low stove made a particular settling noise, a slight ticking of contracting metal that he'd learned to hear in his sleep. He'd rise, add 2 pieces from the indoor stack, adjust the damper, return to his bedroll. The whole process took 4 minutes. He told no one about this system because it had never occurred to him that it was unusual. The questions began arriving at Wren's door in the same quiet, not quite admitting it manner that the problems had arrived in the cabins across the settlement, small at first, apparently casual. Silas's wife, Ruth, knocked one morning with the stated purpose of asking whether Wren had any surplus pitch for patching. Wren had pitch. She handed it across the threshold without comment. 2 days later, it was Del Tanner at the cooking cabin door asking what gauge of stove iron she was running because his stove wasn't holding heat the way it used to. She hadn't modified the stove. She'd modified where she put it, placing it 2 feet from the north wall rather than against it so the wall's cold mass wouldn't draw heat from the stove body during the night. She demonstrated by pointing without speaking further. Del looked at his own stove placement in his mind, and then at her stove placement in reality, and the gap between those two images was its own kind of instruction. Then came the chimney question. A man named Harold Birch, who had said very little about the widow's construction project in October, meaning he had thought quite a lot, came on a quiet afternoon to ask what she'd packed her chimney joints with, because his own were showing cracks after the first freeze. She went inside, came back with a small amount of Agnes's clay mixture in a tin, held it out. He took it, looked at her. She said, "Pack it wet, seal it dry." He waited for more. There was no more. He left with the clay. He tried it that evening. By the next morning, the crack in his chimney joint had been filled in a way that felt different from standard mortar, denser, more responsive to the joint's shape. He mentioned this to no one because to mention it would require acknowledging the source. December arrived with the particular quality of a door being closed from the outside. The temperature dropped on the first of the month and did not come back. Not the daily drop that recovered by noon, but a baseline descent that reset each morning slightly lower than the morning before, as if the cold were establishing territory it intended to keep. The creek froze solid on the 6th, not just the edges, but all the way across a development that the older settlers recognized as meaningful. Agnes Holt, when she heard this reported at Silas's store, said nothing, which everyone nearby interpreted as the absence of concern. They were wrong. Agnes simply saw no purpose in saying what she saw in that particular piece of information to people who would not act on it. On the 8th of December, the sky changed. It changed in the way that Agnes had seen it change in the winter of 1866, in the winter of 1871. Not dramatically, not with the obvious violence of a storm building visibly, but with a settling, a heaviness in the upper air that was almost more like a feeling than an observation. The color was wrong. Not the pale, colorless quality of sustained cold, but something with thickness to it, a smoked quality that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. Agnes put on her second coat, which she had not worn yet this season, and walked north. Wren was in the passage between the sleeping cabin and the cooking cabin when Agnes arrived, checking the canvas cover she'd stretched between the two buildings to make a covered walkway. She looked up. Agnes stopped at the edge of the cleared path, looked at the sky, looked at the cabins, looked at Wren. "I saw that sky before," Agnes told her. "Twice, both times everything that wasn't nailed down right went down." She paused, measuring. "You know what's coming." Wren looked at the sky. She had seen something similar over the Bighorn Ridge that morning, though she'd lacked Agnes's reference for it. "I know something's coming," she said. Agnes studied her with the eyes of someone who has outlived enough people to have developed a precise calibration of who will make it and who won't. "I think you'll be fine," she said, which in Agnes Holt's vocabulary was approximately equivalent to a formal endorsement. She turned and walked south, moving at the same unhurried pace in both directions, as if urgency were a thing she had examined and decided wasn't worth carrying. Wren stood in the passage and looked at the sky for another minute. Then she called to Eli. They spent the rest of that day and all of the next doing things she had planned to do in January, accelerating the timeline into the remaining hours before whatever was coming arrived. The canvas walkway covers went up between all 3 cabins, pine-framed canvas stretch pinned at the base with weighted boards. Additional wood was moved from the outdoor storage structure into the cabin itself, filling a secondary stack she'd built along the interior south wall that could hold enough for 8 days of continuous burning without opening the outer door. Every exterior seam on all 3 cabins received a final coat of the mud mixture, pushed in with a flat stick and smoothed while it was still workable. The double door at the cooking cabin's entrance was checked, rehung, where one hinge had worked slightly loose, refitted with a second layer of canvas across the inside face to create an additional dead air barrier. On the evening of the 10th, with the work completed, Wren stood in the cooking cabin and went through the inventory of the storage cabin from memory. The numbers were adequate. Not generous, she had not been able to afford generous, but adequate for 5 people through March, if nothing catastrophic intervened, and if she was careful about the distinction between adequate nutrition and what she actually wanted to serve. She had been careful about that distinction before. She knew what it cost. The storm arrived on the 12th. It came from the northwest, which she had expected. It came slowly, which she had also expected, though slow was not the same as gentle. It was slow, the way a heavy weight is slow when it's falling toward you, the descent inevitable before it arrives. The wind built through the morning, not gusting, but sustained, the kind of sustained wind that works at things over hours rather than breaking them immediately. By noon, snow was moving horizontally across the basin, and the visibility between Silas's store and the smithy had dropped to a vague gray presence that suggested shapes rather than showing them. By nightfall, the settlement had disappeared into itself. Each cabin became its own isolated fact, surrounded by white noise in every direction. In the cooking cabin, Wren fed the stove, fed the children, reviewed the covered walkways through the small window cut in the north wall. She could see the passage to the sleeping cabin canvas, still holding boards, still weighted. She could see nothing beyond it. The storage cabin door was shut and barred. She had moved the 2-day supply into the cooking cabin before the storm arrived, precisely so the outer door would stay closed. She had explained this rotation to the children one final time, not because they had forgotten, but because the conditions had changed, and the explanation needed to be re-anchored in reality rather than theory. Cooking cabin for meals, warmth, daylight work. Sleeping cabin for night, sealed and slow burning. The passage between them, in 2 minutes, no lingering, always the inner door closed before the outer opened. If something went wrong with one cabin stove failure, structural problem, the other remained. This was not a plan for comfort. It was a plan for the event of failure, which she expected the way a sailor expects weather, not with dread, but with the practical orientation of someone who has decided that preparation is the only honest response to probability. The storm did not relent on the second day. It added weight to itself. The wind did not drop, but the snow thickened, falling now in the layered way of sustained precipitation rather than the driven way of storm winds, so that both conditions existed simultaneously. The kind of snow that found every horizontal surface and committed to it. The kind of wind that found every vertical seam and tested it. On the third day, the main roof beam of Del Tanner's cabin announced its distress with a sound that his wife described afterward as a conversation between 2 boards that ended badly. It did not fail completely. It cracked partially in the center, dropping the roofline on the east side by 3 inches and opening a seam along the ridge that snow immediately began to enter. Del spent 4 hours in the dark and the cold with rags and boards wedging supports under the beam from inside, working by lantern in the falling temperature of a room that had lost its roof's integrity. His wife held the lantern. His children sat on the bed under every blanket they owned. He did what he could. In the morning, the beam was holding barely, and the temperature inside the cabin was 31 degrees. That morning, the Tanner family walked to Wren's sleeping cabin. Del knocked. Wren opened the door, looked at the 5 of them. Del's wife, Margaret, with the baby against her chest. Del with the 2 older children behind him. All of them carrying the particular physical posture of people who have been very cold for a sustained period and have just arrived somewhere warmer, which is a specific kind of relief that moves through the body before the mind has finished registering the new situation. She stepped back. They came in. She pointed Del toward the corner where there was room for the family to spread their bedrolls, and she went to the cooking cabin to start additional food. Nothing was discussed. There was nothing to discuss that the situation hadn't already communicated. On the 5th day, smoke began pushing backward into Pastor Dunmore's rectory through his chimney, which had developed a crack in the upper section, large enough for the sustained wind to create a pressure reversal. His 2 youngest children were coughing by evening, a deep, wet cough that came from inhaled smoke, irritating airways already stressed by cold. He brought them to the cooking cabin, which by then had 4 families cycling through it in shifts, warming, eating, returning to their own cabins for sleep, or coming to Wren's sleeping cabin if their own was compromised. Wren had not planned for this number of people. She had planned for her family. She was now managing something closer to a field operation with a limited fuel supply and no external resupply possible. And she did it without announcing this adjustment, without visibly recalculating, without anything that could be read as distress. She gave the Dunmore children a place near the stove. She fed them. She adjusted the portions across the board smaller, but consistent, and consistent mattered more than full when people were cold because the psychology of reliability was itself a form of warmth. On the seventh day, Silas Pruitt knocked on the cooking cabin door in the early afternoon. He was carrying his youngest daughter, who was 8 years old and whose name was Lily. Lily's breathing had the quality of something working harder than it should, not the dramatic laboring of serious pneumonia, but the elevated, careful breathing of lungs that had been managing cold air and chimney smoke for a week and were beginning to accumulate the cost. Silas's face had the look of a man who had spent a week being wrong about something important and had arrived at the point where being wrong could no longer be maintained without direct consequence to someone he loved. He did not speak at first. He stood in the doorway with Lily against his chest, the wind behind him, and looked at Wren across the room. Wren looked at the child. She stepped back from the door. Silas came in. He sat on the bench nearest the stove, the one placed at the angle that caught the most radiant heat from the stove's side surface. Lily leaned against him with her eyes half closed. Wren went to the shelf near the cooking area, came back with a small clay cup of liquid hot water with willow bark steeped in it, the preparation she'd been making for 3 days for the others who had come through with respiratory distress, and handed it to Silas without a word. He looked at the cup, then at her, then tilted it to Lily's lips. The girl drank. She didn't complain about the bitterness, which told Wren more about how she was feeling than anything visible. Silas sat with his daughter in the warmth and did not speak for a long time. Wren moved around the cabin, doing the work the cabin required, feeding the stove, adjusting the damper, checking the inner door's seal, preparing a thin broth from the bone stock she had kept simmering through the storm in a covered pot at the back of the stovetop. When she finally passed near Silas again, he said it quietly with the particular difficulty of a man for whom this kind of sentence was structurally unusual. "I was wrong about the cabins." She moved to the next task. She did not accept or reject this. She did not soften it or amplify it. She let it be the thing it was, a man arriving late at the truth, and she gave it the room that kind of arrival deserves, which is space rather than comment. After another silence, he said, "How long can you hold this?" She looked at him, then a direct look that lasted long enough to be deliberate. "Long enough," she said, "if nobody opens the storage cabin door." He understood immediately that this meant there was a line she'd drawn, and that it was not a line drawn to exclude him, but a line drawn because the math of survival required lines, and she had spent 4 years learning where they had to go. On the 9th night, the wind changed direction, swinging north-northwest, which brought it through the gap in the Bighorn Ridge at a different angle, one that loaded the northeast corner of the cooking cabin's roof with sudden shift pressure that tests the parts you didn't reinforce, because you expected the load to come from the other direction. Wren felt it through the wall as a change in the vibration, a different frequency than the previous 8 nights. She came fully awake from her half-sleep on the bench, sat up, listened. The cooking cabin held, but through the canvas walkway she could hear something at the sleeping cabin, a sound too faint to be structural, failure too persistent to be the usual creaking of logs settling in cold. She dressed tight her coat, looked at Cora and Amos asleep near the stove, looked at Lily, Pruitt asleep on the bench with her father's coat over her. She went to the walkway. The source was the northeast corner of the sleeping cabin's roof, where the logs sat into the corner notch she'd cut in the early weeks of the build. The notch she'd cut twice because the first attempt had been marginally off the angle she needed. She'd recut it correctly, but the recut had left the wood at that corner marginally thinner than the rest. 9 nights of sustained stress had found it. She went back into the cooking cabin, took the coil of rope from the hook near the door, went back through the walkway and climbed. Eli woke to find her gone. He woke in the practiced way of someone whose sleep is always provisional, not with confusion, but with immediate assessment, scanning for his mother before he was fully upright. He dressed in the darkness and followed. She was on the roof of the sleeping cabin in the dark in the wind, with the lantern she'd hung from a nail in the chimney cap casting a small circle of amber light across the northeast corner. She had looped the rope around the chimney and was threading the other end through a gap she'd created by lifting a piece of the roof boarding, working not with urgency, but with the focused deliberateness of someone doing a job that requires precision more than speed. She needed him before she could thread the rope down through the corner and tie it to the log beneath. He climbed up without being asked. She pointed. He took the rope and fed it through held tension while she tied the knot from outside a bowline around the corner log that would take the outward pressure of the joint and redirect it toward the chimney's fixed mass. They worked without speaking because speech would have cost them both the concentration the work required, because the wind was too loud for speech anyway, because they had been doing necessary things together for long enough that language was often the slowest part. When it was done, she checked the knot from her side, checked his feed-through from below by tugging the rope once felt it hold. She looked at the corner. The sound had stopped. She climbed down. They stood for a moment in the narrow passage between the sleeping cabin and the cooking cabin, the wind moving through the covered walkway at its edges, the lantern swinging on the nail above. She was breathing through her nose, steadying herself after the cold and the effort. He was looking at her face, reading it in the way he'd been reading it since he was old enough to understand that her face was the most reliable weather report available to him. What he saw was not triumph, not relief. Something quieter than both of those, the specific expression of someone whose preparation has just been validated by the exact circumstances they prepared for, which is not a comfortable feeling, because validating the preparation means the threat was real. "Go back in," she said. He went. She stood alone in the passage for another minute, looking at the sky above the walkway's open ends, at the snow moving laterally through the gap between canvas panels. In those weeks of sustained cold, the work had pressed new lines into the corners of her eyes and set her jaw at a slightly different angle. The kind of change a mirror shows you slowly, but that the people around you notice all at once. She looked older than she had in September. She also looked more certain, which is not the same thing as more comfortable, but which has its own kind of hardness. Then she went inside, sat on the bench, put her hands around the warm side of the stove, and did not sleep again until the gray before dawn began to come through the small north window. On the 10th day, people stopped framing it as bad luck. The Dunmore children were improving. Lily Pruitt's breathing had evened out, which Wren had monitored with the specific attention of a woman who had learned to track small respiratory changes with a care that most doctors would have respected. Silas sat in the cooking cabin through the days, now largely silent, doing small repairs to things that needed them. A loose bench leg, a split in the canvas over the window. With the focused application of a man working out an obligation, he doesn't know how to repay directly. Del Tanner had begun watching how Wren moved between the cabins with the same attention he gave to weather. He watched how she opened doors, always the inner door first, pausing in the air gap, then the outer door and the outer closed before the inner opened, always without exception. He watched how she checked the stove's damper before adding wood rather than after. He watched how she assessed the wood before she loaded it, choosing pieces by their density and dryness, rather than simply reaching for what was nearest. He had been running a farm for 16 years. Watching Wren work, he understood that he had known about fuel management the way someone who has read about a country knows about it descriptively, without the texture that comes from having been there when everything was at stake. On the 10th afternoon, Cora unpinned her paper from the cooking cabin post, folded it, and began writing on the back of it. She was writing a new schedule expanded to account for the additional people now cycling through the two open cabins, recalculating the rotation intervals and the stove load timing based on the larger population's heat demand. She did this with the same absence of commentary with which she did everything, and when she'd finished, she repinned it to the post and went back to her sorting work. Silas looked at the paper for a long time. He looked at this 11-year-old girl's handwriting, at the neat columns of times and quantities, at the small corrections she'd made in the margins when her first calculation hadn't satisfied her. He sat with the quiet that comes when a person is being instructed by something they did not expect to be instructed by. On the 11th day, the snow stopped. Not the wind. Not yet the wind took another half day to exhaust itself, moving through the settlement with diminished purpose, knocking at things more from habit than conviction. But the snow stopped, and in the cessation of it, the silence was so complete that several people stepped outside simply to confirm that the world was still there. Harlan's Crossing looked like something that had been through a process rather than a season. 3 roof lines were visibly distorted. A fence line had disappeared entirely. One of the smithy's outbuildings had partially collapsed under weight, the boards fanning outward in the particular way of a structure that has given up rather than failed all at once. The road south was a suggestion rather than a fact. In the cleared path between Wren's three cabins, Eli was shoveling. He was working from the sleeping cabin door outward in both directions, with the even strokes of someone who had been assigned this task and intended to do it completely. Amos worked behind him, spreading sand from a bucket over the cleared surface against refreezing. Cora was checking the walkway canvas for damage, pressing on the frame at intervals, assessing. Del Tanner stood at the edge of the north section of the settlement and watched the three children work in the recovered quiet. They moved around the three cabins in their different tasks with the unhurried coordination of a system that had been running long enough to become automatic. No one directing, no confusion about what needed doing, just the continuous maintenance of a thing that had been built to last. He stood there for a long time in the cold, watching this, before he turned and walked back to look at his own cabin and begin to calculate what it would cost to fix it. The accounting that followed the storm was both individual and collective, though people conducted it privately before they allowed it to become shared. Del Tanner walked his property line in the cold quiet of the first clear morning, assessing his cabin with the eye of a man who could no longer afford the comfortable estimations he'd been making since September. The roof beam that had cracked on the third night had held barely with the temporary bracing he'd wedged under it from inside, but it would not hold another storm of that duration. The east wall showed a hairline separation at the second course that hadn't been there in November. The window frame on the north side had warped in the freeze, creating a gap at the top left corner that a person could pass two fingers through. He stood at each problem in sequence, not yet calculating solutions, just letting the reality of each one complete itself in his mind before moving to the next. The men who started fixing before they'd finished looking always missed the third thing, which was usually the one that mattered most. His wife Margaret found him standing in front of the north window, fingers in the gap, staring at the wall. "We should have sealed it in September," she said. He took his fingers out of the gap. "We should have built it differently in the first place." Silas Pruitt's reckoning took a different form. He did not walk his property line. He sat in the cooking cabin with Lily, her breathing fully recovered, now her color returned, and he watched Wren move through the morning's work. The deliberateness of her, the absence of wasted motion, the way she assessed before she acted and acted without reconsidering. He had spent 3 months reading this as stubbornness, as the inflexibility of someone too proud to take guidance. He understood now that he had been reading it wrong. What he had called inflexibility was something else entirely. It was the behavior of someone who had already done the considering months ago on paper, in a notebook she carried inside her coat, and who was now simply executing the plan that consideration had produced. There was nothing inflexible about it. It was preparation so thorough that it looked to people who hadn't done the same preparation like certainty. He had not done the same preparation. He had done what most of them had done, built based on what he'd seen other people build, trusted that the general approach was sufficient because it had been sufficient until now. Sufficient until now was a different thing than sufficient. He understood that now. Wren was at the shelf near the cooking area doing inventory. She worked with the notebook open, moving her lips slightly as she counted. She made small notations. She did not look up when Silas spoke. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Not about the clay, not about the chimneys." She waited, her pencil still moving. "How long were you planning this before you got here?" The pencil stopped. She turned a page in the notebook, looked at something on it, turned it back. "I started planning it in 1880, she said. "I had the design finished by the spring of '82. He absorbed this. "You knew what you were going to build before you knew where you were going to build it. The design doesn't change with the location," she told him. "You adapt the materials. The principle stays." She closed the notebook. "One fire fails, everything in that room fails with it. The answer to that isn't a better fire. It's more rooms." He sat with this for a while. Lily had fallen asleep against his arm. He looked at his daughter, and then at the low ceiling above her, and then at the stove that had kept her alive, and then at the woman who had built the room the stove was in. He said it finally, without the social formalities the statement usually invited. "I owe you more than I can say." Her response came without hesitation, without softness. "Then build smarter in spring. That's payment enough." The January wind came 12 days after the blizzard ended, as if the weather had rested briefly before resuming its argument with the settlement. This one was different in character, not sustained snowfall, but a single sustained blast, a northwest wind that didn't accumulate so much as a salt arriving in the night and spending itself by the following afternoon. 3 cabins lost shingles. 2 lost sections of their chimney caps, the mortar having frozen cracked and been pulled free by the suction of the wind's passage. Harold Birch's stovepipe separated at a joint, filling his bedroom with smoke before he could reach the damper, driving his family outside into the dark at 2 in the morning. The Birch family came north carrying children and a blanket each. Wren opened the cooking cabin door without discussion. She had expected something like this, not this family specifically, but the principle of it, the near certainty that one sustained cold event would not exhaust the winter's capacity for additional demands. She had planned her supplies against a worst case that included this. The margins were tighter now but present. What was different this time compared to the blizzard was the settlement's behavior in the aftermath. Del Tanner came to the cooking cabin not to ask for warmth, but to ask a question he'd been preparing for 2 weeks. How had she angled her chimney cap to prevent the wind from pulling it loose? She showed him using a small diagram on the back of a piece of canvas scrap, and she explained the principle behind it, the cap's angle relative to prevailing wind direction. The way the geometry of the opening determined whether wind pressure pushed smoke in or pulled it out. The difference between a cap designed for appearance and one designed for aerodynamic behavior in high wind. He listened with the specific quality of attention that means a person is converting what they're hearing into something they will act on immediately. He came back the next day with a follow-up question. She answered it. He came back 2 days after that with a different question about floor joists and ground moisture. She answered that too briefly, concretely, without embroidery. The tone was different from the blizzard days, not desperation reaching for help, but a man who had decided to learn and was doing so methodically. Wren responded to the difference without naming it. When Harold Birch came to ask whether a second stove would help him manage the cold, she asked him instead to describe the dimensions and orientation of his cabin's single room. Listened to the description, then said a second stove in a room that size would overcorrect on fuel consumption. What he needed was a partition, a smaller interior space that the existing stove could manage. He stared at her. Nobody had suggested a partition. She said it was the same principle as 3 cabins, smaller space, more manageable heat, less catastrophic when one element failed. He built the partition in February. Silas left a supply of wood stacked outside the storage cabin door on a morning in late January, a substantial amount, 2 weeks' worth of quality split pine dry from his own indoor store. He did not knock. He did not leave a note. He arrived before Wren was awake, stacked it with care against the cabin's sheltered east wall, covered it with a length of canvas, waited at the corners, and left. Eli found it when he went out for the morning's first load. He told his mother. She looked at the stack, at the careful coverage, at the weight placement on the canvas corners. The placement that showed the person doing it, understood that the corners were where wind got under a cover, and she said nothing. She noted it in the way she noted things that required a different kind of accounting than the one in her notebook. May Griggs began laving a small jar of cream at the cooking cabin door each Monday morning, which Wren used to enrich the bone broth she kept simmering, stretching its caloric density for the rotating population of cold, hungry neighbors who moved through the cabin. Pastor Dunmore's wife sent her 2 daughters to help Cora with the laundry on Thursdays, which had become a significant undertaking given the volume of linen cycling through the 2 open cabins. The daughters came without instruction, observed Cora's system, organized, efficient, entirely her own design, and adapted to it rather than introducing their own. The settlement was changing in a way that didn't require announcement. Families began sealing their interior spaces against the outer wall cold by building interior vestibules, small enclosed entries between the outer door and the living space, a buffer zone of trapped air that didn't need to be heated, only to exist between the cold outside and the warmth inside. 2 families began splitting their single rooms with partition walls. Harold Birch, emboldened by his partition, began planning a separate cookhouse for spring, a proper structure away from the sleeping cabin so that cooking fires wouldn't have to be maintained through the night. He called this practical. Everyone knew what it was. The truth delivered by Agnes Holt to no one in particular. One morning at Silas's store was stated with her characteristic absence of ceremony. They're building the way she built. They just won't say her name while they do it. Silas, who was behind the counter, didn't disagree. In the second week of February, a rider came through from Fort Bridger, a young man in a government-issue coat who arrived stiff from 2 days in the cold and asked directions to the widow's place before he'd even warmed his hands. He carried an official document on territorial government letterhead from the commandant of Fort Bridger. It outlined a consulting arrangement Wren Calloway, having come to the attention of the territorial government through reports from Harlan's Crossing, was offered compensation to advise on shelter construction for military personnel stations along the Wyoming territorial supply routes. The document used the word expertise, which she read twice. The payment terms were, for a woman in her circumstances, substantial. The rider waited while she read it, standing in the cold, not complaining. She refolded the document along its original creases and held it out to him. He blinked at the offered return. "You don't want to keep it?" "Consider it." She looked at the 3 cabins around her, at the cleared paths, at the smoke rising from 2 of the 3 chimneys. "I didn't build to teach," she said. "I built because I had to. Those aren't the same thing." The rider took the document back, clearly uncertain what to do with this. "The commandant will want a reason for the refusal." She looked at the storage cabin door. "Tell him I'm not finished here yet." The spring thaw arrived in the last week of March, tentative. As something not entirely confident, it was welcome. Ice pulled back from the creek edges first, then the south-facing slopes lost their snow in patches, revealing compressed brown grass beneath. The settlement emerged from winter looking reduced, not destroyed, not ruined, but used up by the season in a way that made the faces of its people older than they'd been in September. Older but not beaten. That was the distinction that mattered. The first warm Sunday in April, Pastor Dunmore organized what he called a spring circle, a gathering on the open ground near the widow's place. He sent word around the settlement not because people needed informing, but because the act of sending made the gathering intentional rather than accidental, which was what he wanted it to be. They came in the late morning, families arriving in 2s and 3s, the children running ahead while the adults walked with the careful gait of people who had not fully trusted the ground since December. They formed a loose ring around the 3 cabins, and the 3 cabins stood in the center of the ring in the mid-morning light, looking exactly as they had in October, not worn by the winter, not diminished by it. The lye wash on the exterior walls had darkened slightly with weather, and time giving the pale surface a mottled quality that looked seasoned rather than battered. The roof lines were intact. The chimney caps were in place. Wren stood near the cooking cabin door with her arms crossed. In the weeks of sustained cold, the work had pressed new lines into the corners of her eyes and set her jaw at a slightly different angle. She looked older than she had in September, but also more certain, which is not the same thing as more comfortable, though it has its own kind of hardness. Eli stood beside her, Cora beside him, Amos at the end. They were taller than they'd been in September. The winter had done that to all 3 of them, pressed them upward in the way that hard seasons do, as if the body responds to extended difficulty by reaching. Pastor Dunmore stepped forward. He said what needed saying without performance, that she had saved lives, not just the lives of her own children. That she had done it by knowing things they hadn't known and preparing for things they hadn't prepared for. That she had shared what she had when sharing meant reducing her own margins. That she had not gloated, not demanded acknowledgement, not made the settlement's humiliation the price of her help. He said they had mocked her, which was the word she would have used if she were the one characterizing it, so he used it rather than softening it into something easier. He said he didn't ask forgiveness for all of them, because forgiveness was an individual transaction that he had no authority to conduct on behalf of others. He asked only that she know they had seen it. When he finished, Silas Pruitt cleared his throat. He was standing near the back of the ring, not in front, and he didn't move to the front. He spoke from where he stood, which meant he was speaking to her across the heads of his neighbors, which was harder than speaking from a position of ceremonial centrality, which was probably why he chose it. He said he had been wrong about her from the day she arrived. He said it plainly, without qualifications, without the softening additions that wrong men typically use to dilute the admission. Just wrong. He said his daughter was alive specifically because of what Wren had built. He said he did not know how to make that right, but he was prepared to spend considerable time trying. The ring was quiet in the way that rings of people go quiet when something true has been said in public. Not the quiet of agreement, not the quiet of discomfort, but the quiet that means the thing said has displaced something, and the displacement is still settling. Wren looked at Silas across the ring. She looked at Pastor Dunmore. She looked at Del Tanner at May Griggs with her good-natured eyes that had never been unkind at Agnes Holt standing at the back of the ring with her arms folded. She looked at Lily Pruitt, whose breathing was even now, whose color had been good since January. She said, "You don't need 3 cabins." A pause that was not theatrical, but simply the gap between the first part of the truth and the second. Not unless you've known what it is to lose everything in the night. Then you need 3 at minimum. She turned back toward the cooking cabin door. She stopped, not looking back. What you need is to build like failure is coming, because it is. The only question is whether you've left it somewhere to go when it arrives. She went inside. The door closed. The ring stood in the silence for another moment. Then Agnes Holt turned and began the walk back to her cabin, and one by one, in the manner of a gathering that has received what it came for, they followed. The ground softened fully through April. The creek rose with snow melt from the mountains, running fast and cold and clear, reclaiming the depth it had lost in the previous August. New grass came up in the south-facing patches first, then everywhere, the brown of compressed winter giving way to a green that seemed almost aggressive after the monochrome of the previous 4 months. The settlement began its repair work, not just the damage repair of the storm, but the kind of considered reconstruction that comes from understanding the building differently. Del Tanner hired a carpenter from the next settlement over, and together they replaced the cracked roof beam with a stronger configuration. 2 smaller beams rather than 1 large one, each individually sufficient if the other failed. He didn't frame this to the carpenter as something he'd learned from his neighbor. He framed it as best practice, which it was, and the carpenter agreed and they built it. Harold Birch broke ground on his cookhouse in the second week of April. Its design showed the influence of what he'd observed without his ever stating this directly. The roof pitch was lower than his main cabins. The chimney was shorter. The walls had an interior surface of clay plaster he mixed himself, adapting the formula he'd seen used on Wren's exterior. When the carpenter who had helped Del came to look, he said, "This is tight work." Birch said it was something he'd been thinking about for a while. Wren spent the spring doing what she had always planned to do, preparing the land around the 3 cabins for the season's work, repairing what the winter had used, improving what the winter had revealed as improvable. The canvas walkway frames were taken down, inspected, restacked for next November. The exterior lye wash was refreshed on the north-facing walls. She added 2 new shelves to the cooking cabin's interior pine boards from a supply Silas had arranged the delivery he'd made months earlier, the one he still hadn't spoken about directly. She installed them without reference to their source, which was also a form of acknowledgement. She dug the drainage channels in May. They were shallow trenches, hand-cut, running between the cabins and away from the foundation bases in a gentle grade toward the natural low point of the bluff's eastern slope. She lined them with flat creek stone packing straw between the stones, creating a flexible channel that would move water without clogging. It was work that couldn't be seen from the road, work that would only reveal its purpose when the spring rain came heavy and the foundation ground around the 3 cabins stayed dry, while the rest of the settlement's muddy season produced the usual ankle-deep passages between structures. When the late April rain came 2 weeks earlier than expected, and considerably harder than it had any right to be, the settlement got its lesson in drainage without being taught it formally. The Tanner cabin's east foundation absorbed 2 inches of standing water. The road between the store and the smithy became navigable only in boots. A young couple who had arrived with the spring thaw, Clara and Owen Marsh, with a toddler and a wagon so light it suggested they'd left most of what they owned somewhere behind them, watched their tent site turn to mud in the second hour of rain and stood in the downpour looking at the ground with the expression of people who have run out of next moves. Wren saw them from the cooking cabin doorway. She watched for a moment. Then she crossed the open ground between her property and theirs with a length of canvas and demonstrated without speaking the difference between the angle of their tent and the angle that would shed water rather than collect it. Owen Marsh took the canvas and worked with it. Clara watched him and then watched Wren walking back, and something in the way Wren moved, purposeful, unhurried, as if the rain were simply a condition rather than a problem, produced in Clara an expression that was close to recognition. They came to the cooking cabin that evening and asked whether there was work they could do in exchange for anything Wren could tell them about building in this territory. Wren looked at them for a long moment. "Come back tomorrow," she said. "Early, bring something to write with." They did. She spent the morning showing them the drainage channels, the foundation technique, the chimney construction principles. She did it once completely without rushing. She answered the questions they asked and did not answer the questions they didn't ask, maintaining a clarity she valued. Instruction directed at need, not at display. By June, the Marsh couple had broken ground on their first structure. It had three components. Owen had suggested one larger combined structure, and Clara had said, with a specificity that suggested she'd thought about it, "No, one at a time, separate. If we lose one, we don't lose everything." Owen had looked at her, then at the three shapes on the bluff, then had not disagreed. The first day of June also brought the planting of the apple tree. She had carried the sapling from nursery stock she'd arranged for in Casper during the previous autumn, wrapping its root ball in burlap soaked with water and storing it through the winter in the cool but unfrozen back section of the storage cabin, above the floor depression and below the seed shelf. It had survived. The roots were still white-tipped and viable when she unwrapped it in the early spring light. She planted it in the late afternoon to the east of the storage cabin, far enough from the foundation not to threaten it, when the roots expanded close enough to be in the shelter of the bluff's morning shadow during the hottest part of summer. The hole was 18 inches deep, the soil amended with the compost she'd been building since October. This variety of apple needed 5 years at minimum before it would produce anything. She was planting for a future she could envision without being certain she'd inhabit it, which was, she had come to understand the nature of all serious planting. Eli watched from a few yards away until she'd tamped the soil around the base. Then he stepped closer. His voice was careful in the way of someone testing weight. "What's it for?" She sat back on her heels, looking at the small tree, at the thin branches, reaching upward, with the patience of something that understood it was in the right ground. "For whoever lives here after me," she said. He was quiet for a moment. She had never before spoken of an after, had never located herself in a sequence that implied continuation beyond the immediate necessity of surviving whatever was currently pressing. He understood this was significant without being fully able to name why. "You think someone will—" She stood, brushed the soil from her hands onto her apron. She looked at the three cabins at the walls that had held through 11 days of blizzard, at the chimneys that had not cracked, at the drainage channels already directing the late spring rain away from the foundations with the quiet efficiency of something built correctly. She looked at the storage cabin door closed as it always was, keeping what it kept. She said, "Something I built will." October arrived ahead of schedule in 1884. The way a second winter always arrives a little faster than the first, because you've stopped believing it couldn't. The temperature dropped in the third week of the month, and the grass in the basin went from green-brown to brown-gray overnight, and the creek began its seasonal narrowing, and above the Bighorn Ridge the high clouds carried the gray-white mass that meant serious weather was organizing itself for the descent. The settlement watched these signs with different eyes than it had the year before. Del Tanner had already split his wood by the 1st of October and had it curing under proper cover. Harold Birch had sealed his cookhouse's exterior with his own version of the lye clay mix, adapted from the formula he'd been given and tested and improved through the summer. The Marsh couple had completed their first cabin and were in the first stages of laying the foundation for the second. Clara Marsh had established a seed store and a medical kit before she'd established furniture. Owen Marsh had built his chimney short and tight, and it drew correctly, which he had tested 3 times before he trusted it. On the last evening of October, Wren stood between her 3 cabins in the passage that ran between the sleeping cabin and the cooking cabin. She stood there the way she had stood there exactly 1 year before, looking at the roof lines, listening to the wind off the bluffs, feeling the temperature through her coat. The cabins looked right. They look the way things look when they've been maintained rather than merely survived, not new but good. Solid in the particular way of things that have been tested and found sufficient. Eli came to stand beside her. He was taller now by 2 full inches than he'd been in September of the previous year, his shoulders filling the coat she'd let out at the seams in August. He looked up at the same sky she was looking at, reading it through what he'd learned by watching her read it. Then he looked at her. "Worried?" he asked. She looked at the 3 chimneys, at the storage cabin door, at the small apple tree, to the east. Still there, still alive, its bare October branches reaching upward, with the patience of something that understood it was in the right ground. She thought of the notebook whose pages had been supplemented through the year with new notes, drainage observations, improved clay ratios, a diagram of the marsh cabin layout with suggestions for improvement. She thought of Lily Pruitt Healthy, of the Tanner roof beam which now had a redundant partner alongside it, of Clara Marsh who had said if we lose one without being told to. She thought of what she'd built and of what the building had built, in turn not just the cabins, but the changed behavior of the people around them, the slightly different way they now looked at the problem of winter, which was the same as the slightly different way they now looked at the problem of loss. No, she said. He waited the way she had always waited, with patience rather than expectation. She looked once more at the storage cabin, at its sealed door, at the small carved mark she'd made in the wood of the doorframe in October of the previous year, at the same time as all the other preparations. Two small marks side by side pressed into the wood with a nail. No one had asked about them. She had not explained them. They were not for explanation. They were for remembering, which she did every day without needing to look at them, but which she needed to have in the wood. Nonetheless, the way you need the photograph, even though the face is already in your mind, the way you need the grave marked, even though you know where the hill is. She turned toward the cooking cabin. The stove was already burning. Cora had started it an hour ago, the way she started it every evening now, reliably without being asked. Amos was inside. The smell of bone broth came through the sealed door with a thin line of warmth from the gap at the base. She opened the door. The warmth came out to meet her, as it was built to do. She stepped inside. Behind her, Eli stood alone in the passage for a moment, looking north at the Bighorn Ridge, at the sky above it, doing what the sky was going to do regardless of what anyone below it had built or believed or hoped. Then he came in too, pulling the outer door firmly behind him, checking the seal the way his mother had shown him, pressing the flat of his hand along the frame's edges to feel for the cold coming through. There was none. He checked the inner door the same way. None there either. He crossed to the stove, held his hands near its side without touching it, feeling the heat. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall. Not the violent arrival of a blizzard, just the quiet beginning of a long conversation between the sky and the ground, the kind that would go on for months and required only that the people living between them had built something that could hold. The three cabins held it. They had been built for exactly this. They would hold it again.